They called it a civil war, but it was nothing less than a revolution that shattered a kingdom. From the green fields of Edge Hill to the wind-lashed moors of Worcester, England, Scotland, and Ireland bled for a vision of power and faith that would change the course of history. Kings fell, armies rose, ancient laws crumbled, and out of the smoke, a new idea was born, a nation that would not be ruled by a crown alone. This is not just the story of battles and treaties. It is the story of how ordinary farmers became soldiers, how sermons became rallying cries, and how the fate of the British Isles turned on moments of courage and betrayal. What happened in those years still shapes the world we live in today. So if you believe history is more than dates in a dusty book, if you want to stand on the front lines of the past and feel the roar of the muskets, the clash of steel, and the turning of the tide, then you're in the right place. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we step into the smoke and thunder of the English Civil Wars, and witness the wars that forged a nation. The power struggle. In the years before England was torn apart by civil war, the conflict began not with cannon fire, but with words, decrees, and the relentless will of two opposing forces, the king and his parliament. It was a duel of authority fought in council chambers and court halls, where ink could be as dangerous as steel, and where each side believed it carried the rightful destiny of England upon its shoulders. At the heart of the struggle stood King Charles I, an anointed monarch who believed, without hesitation, in the divine right of kings. To him, the crown was not merely a symbol, it was a sacred charge from God himself, placing him above the shifting tempests of public opinion and parliamentary dissent. In Charles's eyes, his word was law, and Parliament's role was to serve, not to challenge. But across the great chamber of Westminster, the voices of Parliament grew bolder. The Lords and Commons alike argued that the king's authority was bound by ancient custom, bound by the common law, bound by the necessity of consent. They held in their hands not swords, but centuries of precedent that said England was not a land to be ruled by will alone. The tension first surfaced in the bitter disputes over taxation. War on the continent, costly court expenses, and the maintenance of royal power drained the treasury. Yet Charles sought to fill it without the slow, contentious process of parliamentary grants. He revived ship money, an old tax meant for coastal defense, and demanded it across the realm, even from inland counties untouched by the sea. It was a bold move, and a dangerous one. To his supporters, it was the king asserting his rightful prerogative. To his critics, it was tyranny in ink. But money was only the fuel. Power was the flame. Parliament insisted that no monarch could impose taxes without its consent. Charles countered with the chilling reminder that kings before him had ruled without parliaments for years at a time. And so began the cycle. Parliament resisting, Charles dissolving it, then recalling it when funds grew desperate. Each dissolution was like a sword drawn halfway from its sheath, threatening, but not yet striking. The struggle deepened with control over the armed forces. To the king, the army was his to command, the sword of the realm resting firmly in his grip. To Parliament, that sword in the wrong hands could cut down liberty itself. In a time when Europe was aflame with religious wars and dynastic rivalries, the question of who commanded England's soldiers was no mere formality. It was the hinge upon which the fate of the kingdom would turn. Charles's resolve was unshakable. He looked upon Parliament not as a partner in governance, but as an obstacle to be overcome. His supporters, the Royalists, saw him as a bulwark against chaos, a sovereign standing above the petty quarrels of politicians. But to the parliamentarians, his rule without their consent was a shadow of despotism creeping over the land. This was no mere disagreement over law. It was a philosophical war over the very soul of English governance. Was the king the unquestioned master of his realm, ruling by the grace of God and the strength of tradition? Or was he bound to share power, to rule with the consent of those who represented the people. By the early 1640s, the answer no longer seemed possible within the walls of Westminster. The king's pride and Parliament's defiance had passed the point of reconciliation. Each proclamation, each tax demand, each refusal to yield had drawn the lines deeper in the political soil. England stood at the threshold of something far greater and far darker than a constitutional quarrel. The clash of speeches would soon give way to the clash of steel. The power struggle between Charles I and Parliament was more than a chapter in political history. It was the drumbeat before the march, the darkening of the sky before the storm. In those charged years, England was a nation holding its breath, caught between the crown and the commons, knowing that when the silence broke, it would break in fire. The financial crisis. Yet power, no matter how fiercely defended, cannot stand without gold to feed it. The quarrel between Crown and Parliament, already bitter with pride, now found itself poisoned by the slow, grinding hunger of an empty treasury. And it was here, amid ledgers, coin chests, and tax rolls, that the struggle turned from argument to outright provocation. The early 17th century was an age when the cost of kingship was measured not just in honor, but in coin. Maintaining the royal court, funding military campaigns, guarding the seas, and upholding England's stature among the nations, all of it demanded a steady river of silver into the crown's coffers. But by the reign of Charles I, that river had slowed to a trickle. The wars of his father, James I, had drained the reserves. Continental conflicts pulled England into costly entanglements. The royal household itself, a tapestry of grandeur and ceremony, devoured fortunes to keep its brilliance untarnished. Yet the king, bound by his vision of majesty, refused to dim the glow of the crown to balance the books. When Parliament balked at granting him funds without binding concessions, Charles turned to old, half-forgotten instruments of royal prerogative. Chief among them was the levy known as ship money. Once, it had been a wartime tax upon coastal towns to furnish ships for the realm's defense. But Charles, with the steady hand of a man convinced of his own right, extended it to inland counties, places that had never smelled salt air nor seen the masts of the king's fleet. It was a masterstroke of royal assertion and a spark to the powder barrel of discontent. The reaction was swift and bitter. Merchants groaned under the weight of new demands. Landowners bristled at the idea that the king could reach so deeply into their pockets without a voice raised in Parliament. In taverns and marketplaces, the talk turned from grumbling to accusation. Words like tyranny and abuse began to creep into the air, as dangerous to a monarch's rule as any sword drawn in anger. Nor was ship money the only burden. Charles pressed forced loans upon the wealthy, demanding sums under the shadow of royal command. Those who refused risked imprisonment. The crown's agents scoured the countryside, extracting every possible revenue, customs duties, fines, and the sale of monopolies, until even loyal subjects began to whisper of greed. Each act of financial extraction widened the fracture between king and Parliament. In Westminster, the memory of Magna Carta stirred like an ancient lion waking from slumber. No tax without consent, no levy without the people's voice. But Charles saw these protests as challenges to his authority, not as calls for balance. To yield in matters of money, he believed, was to yield the crown itself. It was in these years that the struggle for coin became the struggle for the kingdom. Every unpaid tax was an act of quiet rebellion. Every royal demand was seen as a blow against liberty. The exchequer's emptiness was more than a fiscal problem. It was the sound of the war drums, faint but growing, echoing beneath the debates. By the dawn of the 1640s, the king's financial gambits had cost him more than they gained. Ship money was challenged in the courts, becoming a rallying cry for those who saw themselves as defenders of England's ancient rights. Wealthy men who might have been his allies now stood among his loudest critics. Even common farmers, far from London's political storms, felt the reach of royal collectors in their fields and barns. Thus, the quarrel over power, born in the halls of Parliament, now bled into every village and market square. The people of England began to see the struggle not as a distant dispute among nobles, but as a question that touched their own tables, their own purses, their own futures. The king had sought gold to strengthen his hand. Instead, he had bought resentment. And resentment, once sown, has a way of growing, not into compliance but into defiance. What began as a battle of rights had now found its fuel in the coin of the realm, and that fuel was already catching fire. Soon, the smoke of discontent would rise high enough to be seen from the walls of every castle in England. The religious question. If coin could stir the anger of a people, faith could ignite their very souls. The quarrel between king and parliament, once rooted in law and treasure, now descended into the sacred heart of England's identity, its religion. And in the 17th century, faith was not a private matter of conscience. It was the lifeblood of the nation, the compass of its morals, the banner under which men would live, fight, and die. The fear that gripped England was not born in empty treasuries, but in the shadow of Rome. Memories of the Marian persecutions a century before still haunted the Protestant mind. Bonfires at Smithfield, the screams of heretics condemned for the gospel, the iron hand of papal authority. To many Englishmen, Catholicism was not simply a different creed. It was the yoke of foreign power, the enemy of their hard-won Reformation. Yet on the throne sat King Charles III, whose queen, Henrietta Maria of France, was openly and unapologetically Catholic. Her chapel at court, filled with incense and candles, was to Puritan eyes a scene of idolatry. Her influence upon the king was whispered about in taverns and thundered against from pulpits. "If the queen bends the king's ear," they muttered, "will England not bend its knee to Rome?" Worse still, Charles had chosen as his spiritual lieutenant William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury, a man determined to bring beauty, ceremony, and uniformity back to the English Church. Altars were raised, vestments brightened, and the Book of Common Prayer enforced with uncompromising zeal. To Laud, this was the restoration of reverence. To the Puritans, it was the creeping hand of popery dressed in Anglican robes. The Puritans were no mere fringe of zealots. They were a force woven deep into the fabric of England. Merchants, magistrates, and ministers alike. They believed the Reformation had stopped halfway, leaving the English Church tangled in the thorns of superstition. For them, the path to godliness meant stripping away every remnant of Catholic ritual, purging the sanctuary until only the pure word remained. And now, under Charles and Laud, they felt that path was being blocked by gilded altars and the king's unyielding will. In Parliament, these fears became demands. No bishop should hold a seat in the Lords. No church should enforce rituals that smacked of Rome. The king refused. In his eyes, bishops were not political pawns but guardians of divine order. To strip them of their place was to strike at the very hierarchy God had ordained. This was no longer about taxes or statutes. It was about the architecture of heaven itself. Beyond England's shores, the storm grew darker still. In Scotland, Charles's attempt to impose the English prayer book in 1637 had sparked riots, leading to the bishops' wars. The Scots, fierce in their Presbyterian convictions, saw the king's policy as spiritual tyranny. They signed the National Covenant, swearing to defend their faith against all innovations. The sword of religion had been drawn there first, and it would not be sheathed until it had tasted English blood as well. Thus, the quarrel between king and parliament had gained a third, sharper edge. No longer could it be confined to the question of who ruled England or who filled its coffers. Now it was a matter of who spoke for God in the realm. The pulpit became as much a weapon as the musket. Sermons rang with calls to defend the true faith, and every Sunday, England's churches became rallying grounds for war without yet naming it. By the early 1640s, the people no longer argued in terms of policy, but in terms of salvation and damnation. To side with the king was, in the eyes of many, to risk the soul of England. To oppose him was to risk rebellion against God's anointed. It was a choice that tore families apart, set neighbor against neighbor, and lit the first embers of the fire that would consume the kingdom. The quarrel over power had become a battle over coin. Now the battle over coin had become a crusade for the soul. And when men believe they fight for the soul of their nation, they will march through blood and ruin to see their vision made flesh. The war was coming, and this time it would march beneath the banners of heaven. The trigger events. And so it was that the quarrel over power had grown into a battle for the soul. But belief, once sharpened by fear, demands action. England was no longer merely debating. She was moving, step by dangerous step, toward the point where words could no longer hold back the steel. The first spark came from the north. In 1639 and 1640, the bishops' wars with Scotland had already tested the king's resolve. Charles, determined to enforce religious conformity, marched against the Covenanters, only to find his treasury too poor and his armies too ill-prepared to impose his will. The defeats were humiliating. To pay for the war, he was forced to summon Parliament once more, though he had ruled without it for 11 long years. It was a concession made in desperation, and desperation has a way of revealing weakness. The short Parliament of April 1640 lasted barely 3 weeks. Members refused to grant the king money until their grievances were addressed. Charles dissolved them in anger, as he had so many times before. But his need for funds was relentless, and by November he called the Long Parliament, a gathering that would not dissolve peacefully for the next 20 years. This Parliament was different. It was not content merely to petition. It sought to dismantle the very machinery of royal absolutism. It abolished the Star Chamber, curtailed the king's ability to raise taxes without consent, and demanded that Parliament itself be called regularly. Each bill passed was a stone removed from the fortress of the king's authority. But the most decisive blow to trust came in January 1642. Convinced that certain members of the Commons had plotted treason against him, Charles resolved to strike a show of royal force. Accompanied by armed guards, he entered the House of Commons itself, a place where no monarch had ever dared to tread in such a manner, to arrest the 5 members. John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Halls, Sir Arthur Hazelrig, and William Strode. It was a moment meant to display power, but it revealed vulnerability. Warned in advance, the 5 had already fled. Charles found the chamber empty, and as he looked upon the hostile faces of the members, he realized his authority had slipped beyond his grasp. His words, "I see the birds are flown," rang not as a triumph, but as an admission of failure. As he withdrew, the streets of London filled with crowds jeering the king. For many, this was the moment the breach could no longer be healed. From that day, the city was a cauldron. Armed militias loyal to Parliament drilled openly. The king withdrew from London entirely, gathering his loyalists in the countryside. Parliament, now in control of the capital, began raising its own armies. The question was no longer if there would be war, it was when. And then came the final signal. On 22 August 1642, at Nottingham, Charles raised the royal standard against the wind, calling all loyal subjects to his side. It was a symbolic act older than the Tudors, a declaration that the king's cause was now a cause of arms. Messengers rode through the shires, church bells tolled in towns and villages. The realm chose its colors, royalist white or parliamentarian orange. No treaty could unmake this moment. The gloves were off, the swords were drawn, and England stood divided. The quarrel that had begun in the chambers of Westminster had spilled into the fields and market squares, soon to be written not in ink, but in the blood of her sons. The storm had broken. The war had begun. The political and social climate. The royal standard fluttered above Nottingham, its fabric snapping in the wind like the first roll of distant thunder. War had been declared in all but name, and yet the swords had not yet met in earnest. For a moment, brief, tense, electric, England stood in the pause between the raising of the banner and the clash of armies. It was in this pause that the true weight of the conflict could be felt in every corner of the realm. From the gilded halls of Whitehall to the smallest thatched village, politics had spilled into daily life. No man or woman could remain untouched. Conversations in market stalls turned sharp. Parish meetings became battlegrounds of words. Neighbors who had once shared ale now eyed each other with suspicion, searching for the telltale signs, an emblem, a whispered prayer, a family connection that might mark friend or foe. The division was not merely political, it was personal. The Royalists, often drawn from the great landowning families, Anglican clergy, and those bound by loyalty to tradition, spoke of preserving the ancient order, of defending the king's rightful place against the chaos of mob rule. They wore their cause like a badge of honor, invoking the chivalry of past centuries, believing themselves guardians of England's continuity. The parliamentarians, by contrast, saw themselves as defenders of liberty, heirs to the legacy of Magna Carta, sworn to keep the king from ruling as a tyrant. Among their ranks were Puritans, merchants, small landowners, and a growing urban population whose fortunes were tied not to feudal loyalty, but to trade and enterprise. They spoke in the language of reform and accountability, believing the future of England must be forged by consent, not by decree. Between these two visions lay the common people, plowmen, craftsmen, fishmongers, pulled by ties of patronage, faith, or fear. For many, the choice of side was less about lofty principle and more about survival. If your landlord declared for the king, you risked eviction if you did not follow. If your town's militia drilled under Parliament's colors, you would be a fool to oppose them openly. In this way, allegiance spread not just through conviction, but through necessity. The air in 1642 was thick with both excitement and dread. Recruitment drives filled the streets with the sound of drums. Horses were bought at twice their worth. Blacksmiths worked day and night to forge pikes and shoe mounts. Churches rang with sermons that could be either rallying cries or warnings of damnation, depending on the preacher's sympathies. In the taverns, songs and ballads mocked the enemy's leaders, each side painting the other as fools, traitors, or heretics. In the great cities, London, York, Oxford, political clubs and coffee houses buzzed with speculation. Pamphlets poured from the presses at an unprecedented rate, each declaring its truth with the force of revelation. Literacy was no longer just a skill, it was a weapon. The printed word could rally a county or ruin a commander's reputation overnight. And all the while, fear walked hand in hand with conviction. The 30 Years' War still raged across Europe, its tales of famine, plunder, and massacre carried to English ears by returning soldiers and wandering mercenaries. Everyone knew what civil war could mean. Crops burned in the fields, towns sacked, children starving. It was not the romance of knights in shining armor, it was the grim reality of neighbor against neighbor. By the closing months of 1642, England was no longer one kingdom. It was two nations occupying the same soil, divided by loyalty, faith, and vision. The banners had been chosen, the lines drawn, and though the first major clash of arms still lay ahead, the war had already begun, in the hearts, minds, and hearths of her people. The storm was gathering. Soon, the fields of England would be more than pastures and farmlands. They would be battlefields. And when the first musket cracked, the long, dark road of civil war would open before them all. The outbreak of war. The storm that had rumbled for years now broke upon England's fields with thunderous force. The banners had been chosen, the speeches made, the hearts steeled, and at last the waiting ended. Where once there had been only pamphlets and sermons, now there was the ring of steel and the smell of powder. The English Civil War had begun. In the late summer of 1642, the king's standard flew at Nottingham, a defiant signal to every loyal subject that the time for petitions had passed. Across the realm, messengers galloped through villages and market towns, summoning men to arms. Drums beat in parish squares, calling farmers from their plows, apprentices from their benches, merchants from their counting houses. War was no longer a matter for London's Parliament or the King's Court. It had come to every hearth and every hand. The first weeks of the conflict were chaotic. Local skirmishes flared in towns where rival militias met, testing their courage in sudden bursts of musket fire. Garrisons were seized, bridges fortified, and supplies hastily gathered. In many places, the two sides eyed each other across the same fields, neither willing to commit to a full engagement until their forces were ready. But the inevitability of battle pressed closer with each passing day. That moment came on 23 October 1642, upon the rolling ground near Edge Hill in Warwickshire. The King's army, marching from Shrewsbury toward London, found its path barred by the parliamentarian forces under Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Both armies were raw, their soldiers untested, their commanders still learning the art of war in a land that had not seen such a conflict in generations. Yet here they stood, two visions of England drawn up in line, muskets primed, cavalry restless. The morning was cold and still. From the royalist position atop Edge Hill, banners snapped in the wind. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's fiery nephew, sat astride his charger, the very image of continental cavalry skill. Below, Essex's parliamentarians arrayed their ranks with grim determination, their pikes and muskets forming a hedge of defiance. When the guns opened, the sound rolled across the countryside like the voice of judgment. Cannon belched smoke and iron, tearing gaps in the ranks. Musketeers advanced and fired in volleys, the air thick with acrid powder. Then came the charge, Rupert's cavalry thundering down the slope, their sabers flashing, scattering the parliamentarian horse. For a moment, it seemed the king's men might sweep the field. But the parliamentarians held. On the infantry line, stubborn discipline countered the royalist momentum. Push met push, steel met steel, and the day dragged on into a bloody stalemate. By nightfall, neither side could claim a decisive victory. The field lay strewn with the dead and dying, and the war's first great lesson was written in blood. This would not be a short or gallant struggle, but a long and merciless trial. Though Edge Hill resolved nothing, it shattered illusions. The king had not been able to march unopposed to London. Parliament had not been able to crush the royalist cause in a single stroke. Both sides now understood that the war would demand not just courage, but endurance, strategy, and the will to fight through years of uncertainty. As winter drew in, armies withdrew to winter quarters, but the air remained charged with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The powder had been lit, the first shots fired, and England's fate was now bound to the fortunes of war. The long road of battle stretched ahead, and neither king nor parliament would turn from it. The fronts of 1643. The winter that followed Edge Hill brought no peace, only the cold silence of armies resting before the next storm. Both king and parliament used those months to recruit, train, and arm for the campaigns to come. When the thaw of 1643 arrived, the war burst forth again, this time not as a single clash between two great hosts, but as a web of battles stretching from Cornwall to Yorkshire. Each fought for towns, roads, and rivers that could decide the fate of entire regions. In the southwest, the Royalists held the advantage. Sir Ralph Hopton, commanding the king's forces in Cornwall and Devon, moved with skill and speed. His Cornish infantry, hardened by loyalty and local pride, swept through the countryside, seizing parliamentarian strongholds and driving their foes eastward. The parliamentarian commander in the region, William Ruthven, struggled to match Hopton's momentum, and by spring the Royalists had secured much of the West Country. In the north, the Royalist cause was championed by William Cavendish, Earl of Newcastle. His army, drawn from the wealthy northern counties, was bolstered by experienced cavalry and local gentry who rallied to the king's banner. Newcastle pushed deep into Yorkshire, taking towns and fortresses and tightening his grip around the crucial city of York, a royalist bastion that would become the heart of the Northern War. Yet in the Midlands and the southeast, Parliament struck back. Sir William Waller, nicknamed William the Conqueror by his admirers, proved himself a master of sudden offensives. From his base in Gloucester, he launched raids that disrupted royalist supply lines, seizing key towns and breaking the king's hold on parts of southern England. His successes kept royalist forces tied down, unable to join larger campaigns elsewhere. The year 1643 also saw the war take to the rivers and coasts. Control of ports like Bristol, Hull, and Plymouth meant control of vital supplies and foreign trade. Parliament's navy, loyal to the cause from the outset, maintained dominance at sea, strangling royalist attempts to import arms and aid from abroad. On land, sieges became the order of the day, long, grinding affairs that tested the patience and endurance of soldiers and civilians alike. Towns like Gloucester and Hull found themselves encircled, their walls bristling with cannon, their streets echoing with the cries of the hungry. In London, Parliament worked to bind its forces together with a clearer chain of command, appointing capable generals and securing the allegiance of key counties. In Oxford, the king held his court, the ancient university city transformed into the royalist capital, its colleges turned into barracks, its quadrangles echoing with the tramp of soldiers' boots. From there, Charles issued orders, gathered councils, and plotted the reconquest of his kingdom. But if 1643 showed anything, it was that neither side could deliver a knockout blow. Victories were won, towns were taken, but for every advance came a counterstroke. The war was no longer a matter of one decisive battle. It had become a campaign of many fronts, each feeding into the larger struggle. The roads of England were filled with marching columns, the skies with the smoke of burning farms, and the hearts of her people with a mixture of pride, fear, and unyielding resolve. Still, even as the fighting spread, both king and parliament began to see that this war would not be won by arms alone. Allies would be needed, foreign or domestic, if one side was to gain the upper hand. And in the north, events would soon draw such an ally into the field, one whose entry would alter the balance of the war: the Kingdom of Scotland. The Strategic Alliance. By the closing months of 1643, it had become clear to both king and parliament that the war could not be won by sword alone. The fields of England were strewn with the proofs. Campaigns won in the south were lost in the north, victories in the west balanced by defeats in the east. The realm was locked in a deadly stalemate, and the side that broke it would need more than courage and powder. It would need allies. The king's court at Oxford looked to Ireland first. In a bold and controversial move, Charles negotiated a truce with the Irish Confederate Catholics, hoping to free up English royalist troops stationed there and perhaps bring Irish reinforcements across the sea. But this plan, even before it could bear fruit, sowed seeds of mistrust. Many in England saw any pact with Catholic Ireland as treachery, a betrayal of Protestant cause, and it hardened parliamentarian resolve. Parliament, meanwhile, cast its eyes northward to Scotland, a realm bound to England not only by shared borders, but by shared faith. The Scots, fierce and disciplined, had already proven their mettle in the bishops' wars, and their Calvinist Presbyterianism aligned closely with Parliament's Puritan faction. Yet Scotland would not fight for mere sentiment. They wanted guarantees, religious guarantees, that their faith would not only be respected, but enshrined. Thus began the delicate negotiations that would lead to the Solemn League and Covenant. In September 1643, commissioners from the English Parliament and the Scottish Covenanter government met in Edinburgh. The agreement they forged was both political and sacred. Scotland would send an army south to aid Parliament against the king, and in return, England would reform its church, according to the Word of God and the example of the best Reformed churches, effectively promising a Presbyterian settlement. It was a covenant in the truest sense of the word, sealed not just with ink, but with oaths before God. In churches across Scotland, congregations stood and swore to uphold it. In Parliament, members lifted their right hands as they pledged. This was no casual alliance. It was a marriage of necessity and conviction, binding two nations in common cause. The arrival of the Scottish army in January 1644 was a spectacle to stir the soul and chill the blood. Under the command of Alexander Leslie, Earl of Leven, some 20,000 seasoned soldiers crossed the frozen border, their pikes and muskets glinting in the pale winter sun. They were veterans of continental wars, disciplined in the grim arts of siege and maneuver, and their presence transformed the northern theater overnight. For the Royalists, it was a dire turn. The Earl of Newcastle, already stretched by parliamentarian resistance in Yorkshire, now faced a new, well-equipped enemy pouring down from the north. The parliamentarians, by contrast, found their fortunes rising. With Scottish steel beside them, they could challenge Royalist control of the north in earnest, threatening the great prize of York itself. But this alliance carried within it the seeds of future tension. The Scots fought not only for Parliament's victory, but for a religious settlement that would see England remade in their own Presbyterian image. Parliament's army, divided between Presbyterians and the increasingly assertive Independents, did not speak with one voice on the matter. For now, these differences were set aside. But they would return in time, as all bargains made in the shadow of war eventually do. For the moment, however, the Solemn League and Covenant had tipped the scales. Parliament now stood not as a besieged faction, but as a force with two armies and a cause sanctified in the eyes of its northern brethren. And in the spring of 1644, the combined weight of English and Scottish arms would march toward the battle that could decide the fate of the North. Marston Moor. The campaign context. The ink of the Solemn League and Covenant had barely dried when its promise was put to the test. The Scottish army's arrival in the bitter winter of 1644 was not a gesture, it was a weapon, and it was meant to strike at the very heart of Royalist power in the north. For Parliament, the target was clear, the city of York. York was no mere dot on the map. It was the jewel of the north, a fortress of ancient walls and deep history, the seat of Royalist authority in the region, and the keystone in the Earl of Newcastle's northern command. Whoever held York could command the roads, rivers, and resources that fed the war in half of England. To lose it would be to surrender the north entire. The Scottish commander, Alexander Leslie, Earl of Leven, knew his business. His army, disciplined, well-provisioned, and honed by years of continental warfare, marched south with cold efficiency, their banners snapping in the wind, their long pikes carried at the slope. Alongside them moved the northern parliamentarian forces under Lord Fairfax and his son Sir Thomas Fairfax, men who had fought the Royalists in Yorkshire with grim determination even before the alliance was struck. Together, they began the slow, deliberate tightening of a noose around York. Inside the city, the Earl of Newcastle faced a cruel arithmetic. His army had been worn thin by months of campaigning. His supplies were finite. His lines of communication were narrowing by the day. Still, he resolved to hold. Behind York's medieval walls, Royalist gunners readied their pieces, while the citizens prepared for siege in the old manner, stockpiling grain, salting meat, and drawing water from hidden wells. The white rose of York still flew proudly over the gatehouses, but it fluttered now in the shadow of Parliament's and Scotland's rising strength. In the south, the king's cause was not idle. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's most daring and unpredictable commander, received orders to relieve York at any cost. Rupert, never one to shrink from audacity, saw not just the necessity, but the opportunity. A victory in the north could reverse the tide of the war, shatter the parliamentarian Scottish alliance, and restore Royalist supremacy. Gathering a swift, hard-hitting force, he began his march north, his cavalry cutting through the countryside like a drawn sword. The campaign thus became a race, Parliament and the Scots to close their grip on York, Rupert to break that grip before the city fell. Skirmishes flared along the approach routes. Supply convoys were ambushed. Bridges were seized, lost, and seized again. Every mile mattered. Every delay could be fatal. By June, Rupert was pushing through the Pennines, moving faster than the parliamentarians had expected. The tension in the Allied camp grew with each day's reports. On June 22, 1644, York was fully invested. Leven, Fairfax, and the Scots tightened their siege lines, their artillery digging in for the slow, methodical pounding that would breach the walls. Yet even as they prepared for the siege to grind on, the news came. Rupert was on the move, and he was coming with speed and fury. His march was no mere relief column. It was a hammer blow aimed straight at the heart of their position. Thus, the stage was set. 3 armies, the Scots, the parliamentarians, and the king's northern host, were converging on a single city. The fate of York, and with it the fate of the north, would be decided not by parchment or promise, but by the clash of steel and the roar of cannon. And in the fields west of the city, near a stretch of open land called Marston Moor, history was already drawing its breath for one of the most decisive battles of the war. The forces assembled. Thus the fate of York and of the north hung in the balance as 3 great hosts converged on the open ground west of the city. The siege lines that had tightened like an iron collar now trembled under the approach of a royalist rescue. In the last days of June 1644, the fields around Marston Moor began to fill with soldiers, banners, and the restless sound of armies making ready for battle. The Allied army was of the first to stand in full array, commanded jointly, though not always harmoniously, by Alexander Leslie, Earl of Leven for the Scots, Lord Fairfax, and the Earl of Manchester. It was a formidable coalition of parliamentarian and Scottish Covenanter troops. At its heart stood the Scottish infantry, veterans of the European wars, drilled to perfection and steadfast under fire. Their long pikes bristled in dense squares, ready to repel cavalry or press an assault. Alongside them marched the English parliamentarian foot, hardened by years of skirmishing in Yorkshire and the Midlands. Supporting the infantry was the parliamentarian cavalry, increasingly molded by the hand of Oliver Cromwell, still a rising commander, but already forging the disciplined Ironsides that would become legendary. Mounted on sturdy horses, armed with pistols and swords, these troopers brought a new kind of determination to the field. The will to charge not once and wheel away, but to break the enemy and ride them down without mercy. The Royalist army approached under the fiery banner of Prince Rupert of the Rhine. His march north had been swift and bold, his reputation as a cavalry commander unmatched in England. With him came a striking force of Royalist horse, long the pride of the king's cause, trained to deliver devastating shock charges at speed. Behind them followed the infantry of the Earl of Newcastle, Yorkshiremen and northern loyalists who had fought stubbornly for their king and county, their loyalty sharpened by the threat of parliamentarian conquest. The Royalists also brought artillery, though fewer guns than the Allies, and a contingent of musketeers seasoned in the brutal sieges of the war's earlier years. But it was Rupert himself, reckless, confident, and unwilling to accept anything less than a decisive victory, who was the true rallying point for the king's men. His arrival lifted the spirits of York's garrison and promised to break the Allied siege in one thunderous blow. By early July, the numbers had swelled beyond anything the war had yet seen in the north. The Allies could muster around 28,000 men, perhaps 14,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and a formidable train of artillery. Rupert's Royalists numbered closer to 18,000, about 11,000 infantry and 7,000 horse. But what they lacked in numbers, they sought to make up in speed, daring, and the shock power of Rupert's charge. The sheer scale of the gathering was awe-inspiring. For miles around, the roads were clogged with baggage trains, powder carts, herds of cattle for slaughter, and the endless press of men under arms. Farmers from nearby villages watched from hedgerows as columns of pikes passed like forests in motion, while the neighing of horses and the rumble of gun carriages carried on the wind. At night, the glow of campfires stretched across the moor like a second horizon. Yet beneath the spectacle lay tension. The Allied command was divided between Scottish caution and the parliamentarians' desire for a decisive blow. The Royalists, too, were not without friction. Rupert's authority was strong in the field, but Newcastle's northern captains resented his imperious style. These rivalries would soon be swept aside by the urgency of battle, but in the shadow of Marston Moor they were as real as the sharpened steel. And so the army stood, tens of thousands of men, drawn from England's shires and Scotland's glens, gathered under a summer sky heavy with the promise of rain. The ground between them would soon be churned to mud by hooves and boots, the air shattered by cannon and musketry. In that place, on that day, the destiny of the North would be decided, and the war itself would take a turn from which there could be no going back. The eve of battle. The two great hosts now faced each other across the rolling fields and hedgerows west of York. Between them lay Marston Moor, a broad, open expanse of scrub and farmland, its undulating ground broken only by the occasional ditch or copse of trees. In summer, it was a place for grazing sheep and cutting hay. In July of 1644, it was about to become a graveyard. From the moment Prince Rupert's cavalry crested the ridge and his standards appeared in the distance, the air between the armies seemed to tighten. Word swept through the Allied siege lines that the Royalist relief force had arrived. The noose around York had been cut, at least for now. The Scots and parliamentarians would have to decide: withdraw, entrench, or meet Rupert in the open. Alexander Leslie, Earl of Leven, was not a man to be rushed into battle on another's terms. His instinct was to hold his ground. Let Rupert make the first mistake. But the parliamentarian commanders, Lord Fairfax and the Earl of Manchester, argued that the moment was ripe. They had the numbers, the guns, and the high ground to the west. Let Rupert come, and they would break him. The Royalist camp, for its part, was alive with Rupert's restless energy. Scouts rode out through the long summer twilight, bringing back word of enemy dispositions. Newcastle's weary garrison, newly relieved, stood ready to march out and join the prince. For the Royalists, this was more than a battle. It was a chance to shatter the parliamentarian Scottish alliance and reclaim the North in one stroke. Yet not all were eager. Some of Newcastle's officers, drained by months of siege, urged caution. But Rupert, as ever, would not be denied. He had not ridden the length of England to sit idle. The night of July 1st fell warm and damp. Across the moor, thousands of campfires burned, their glow flickering against the low clouds. From the Scottish lines came the sound of psalms sung in deep, steady voices. From the parliamentarian tents, the murmur of prayers and the rasp of whetstones on sword edges. In the Royalist camp, laughter and song mingled with the clink of harness buckles as men readied their gear for the morning. Horses stamped in the dark, feeling the tension in their riders' hands. Between the lines lay a strange quiet. The wind moved in the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Somewhere in that stillness, men who would be dead by the next evening stared into the flames and thought of home, of wives, children, and fields now far away. For others, there was only the anticipation of the charge, the clash, and the glory to be won. Strategically, both sides knew the ground favored a decisive engagement. Marston Moor's openness would give cavalry room to maneuver, an advantage Rupert counted on. But the Allies held the higher ridges and the stronger artillery positions. The weather, too, loomed over every calculation. Dark clouds threatened to break, and rain would turn the fields to mud, blunting the force of horse and foot alike. As midnight passed, sentries strained their eyes into the gloom, and commanders finalized their plans. Orders were whispered along the lines, powder was kept dry under oiled cloth, matches for muskets and cannon were lit and ready. Above all else, each army knew that retreat was no longer an option. York was at stake. The North was at stake. Perhaps even the war itself. Dawn would bring no more speeches, no more debate. Only the meeting of steel and the roar of guns. And so, in the heavy silence of the moor, under a sky swollen with storm, England held its breath for the day that was coming, a day that would change the course of the Civil War forever. The Battle of Marston Moor. Dawn on July 2nd, 1644, broke gray and heavy, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. Rain had fallen in the night, leaving the ground slick beneath the boots of infantry and the hooves of restless cavalry. Yet no storm could cool the fire that burned in the hearts of the tens of thousands gathered on either side. The siege of York had ended. Now, its fate would be decided in open battle. For much of the day, the armies watched each other across the moor, lines drawn, cannon silent. Rupert intended to provoke the Allies into attacking on unfavorable ground, while the Parliamentarian and Scottish commanders preferred to hold their advantageous ridge positions. It was a tense stalemate, the kind that can break suddenly and without warning. That break came in the late afternoon. As dark clouds gathered again and a summer storm threatened, Rupert, perhaps believing the Allies were preparing to withdraw for the night, began to relax his line. Allied scouts spotted the movement. Seizing the moment, Alexander Leslie, Earl of Leven, ordered the attack. It began with a thunder of guns. Allied artillery roared from the ridge, pounding the Royalist positions and masking the advance of infantry columns. Then, in the center, the Scottish pike blocks and Parliamentarian musketeers surged forward, their standards whipping in the wind. On the flanks, the cavalry moved, most notably on the Allied left, where Oliver Cromwell led his disciplined Ironsides against the Royalist horse under Goring. The charge was as precise as it was powerful. Cromwell's cavalry smashed into the Royalist flank, driving them back step by step. The Ironsides did not wheel away after the first clash. As was the old habit, they pressed on, cutting through the enemy line and turning inward to strike the Royalist center from the side. Rupert's famed cavalry, caught off guard and hampered by the wet ground, could not regain momentum. In the center, the fight was brutal and close. Muskets fired at near point-blank range. Pikes locked in grinding shoves. The air filled with smoke, rain, and the cries of the wounded. The Scottish infantry, grim and methodical, held their line against repeated Royalist pushes. Newcastle's northern loyalists fought with the desperation of men defending their homes, but their courage could not outweigh the growing weight of numbers against them. On the Allied right, Sir Thomas Fairfax and his cavalry clashed with Rupert's other wing in a swirling melee of sabers and pistols. Though driven back at first, Fairfax's men rallied under the pressure, buying time for Cromwell's victorious left to sweep across the field. By evening, the Royalist position was collapsing. Rupert's cavalry, once the terror of Parliamentarian troops, was scattered. Newcastle's infantry was being pushed back toward York in disarray. The rain came harder, turning the moor to mud and hampering any hope of organized retreat. What had begun as a contest for the North had become a rout. When the guns finally fell silent, the field of Marston Moor was strewn with the dead and dying. The Royalists had lost some 4,000 men, with thousands more captured. York, now isolated, would soon fall. For the first time in the war, the king's cause had suffered a crushing defeat from which it would never fully recover in the North. That evening, as darkness settled over the moor, the Allies stood triumphant. The Scots sang psalms of victory. Parliamentarian officers clasped hands in the rain. In the quiet beyond the roar, men like Cromwell knew that this day had changed more than a campaign. It had shifted the balance of the entire war. From Marston Moor onward, the road to Royalist defeat had truly begun. Aftermath and strategic consequences. The guns had fallen silent, yet the moor still groaned with the weight of battle. The rain that had drenched the fighting now mingled with the dark pools beneath the fallen. In the fading light of July 2nd, 1644, The victors moved slowly among the wreckage, Scottish pikemen prodding the mud for enemy muskets, parliamentarian troopers rounding up prisoners, and surgeons tending to the wounded where they lay. For every cheer of triumph, there were a dozen voices calling for water, for aid, or for God. The scale of the Allied victory was undeniable. Of the 18,000 royalists who had come to Marston Moor, some 4,000 lay dead, and nearly 1,500 more were captured. The Earl of Newcastle, his army shattered, chose exile over returning to face the king's wrath. Prince Rupert, though escaping with his life and a fragment of his cavalry, had suffered the worst defeat of his career. His reputation, forged in the shock and speed of the charge, had been bloodied in the mire of the moor. For the Allies, the road into York now lay open. Within 2 weeks, the city surrendered, ending royalist power in the north. What had been a region contested for 2 years was now firmly in parliamentarian and Scottish hands. The victory also secured a vital strategic base from which Parliament could project its strength into the Midlands and beyond. Politically, the triumph deepened the partnership between Parliament and the Scottish Covenanters. The Solemn League and Covenant, signed in the cold of the previous year, had been tested in the fire of battle, and it had held. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Scots had borne a heavy share of the fight and expected their influence in the post-war settlement to match their sacrifice. Parliamentarian leaders, for their part, viewed the growing prestige of Oliver Cromwell and his cavalry with both admiration and unease. In military terms, Marston Moor was a turning point of the First Order. The Royalists, already stretched thin, could no longer hope to regain control of the north. The defeat deprived the king of a crucial recruiting ground, grain supply and strategic depth. It also shattered the aura of invincibility that had long surrounded Rupert's cavalry. Parliamentarian morale soared. Royalist confidence faltered. For Cromwell, the battle was a personal watershed. His Ironsides had not merely held their ground. They had driven the enemy from it with relentless discipline. The style of cavalry warfare he had championed, steady in formation, unwilling to break off until the enemy was routed, had proven decisive. Observers began to see in him more than a capable officer. They saw the shape of a future general. The cost, however, was steep. Allied casualties numbered in the thousands, and the human toll would be felt for months in the towns and villages of Yorkshire and Scotland alike. Many who had marched to Marston Moor never returned. Many who did return bore wounds that would mark them for life. The moor itself, once a place for grazing and harvest, was left scarred, its soil churned by hoof and boot, its hedgerows splintered by cannon shot. And yet, in the cold reckoning of war, the outcome could not be overstated. Marston Moor was more than a battle. It was the moment when the Royalist cause began its long descent. From this day forward, the king's armies would be fighting not for dominance, but for survival. The North was lost, and with it the strategic initiative. As the survivors marched away under heavy skies, the moor lay quiet once more. But in the councils of war, in the halls of Parliament, and in the king's court, the echo of that day would sound for the rest of the conflict. The balance of the English Civil War had shifted, and England would never be the same again. Army reform. The moor was silent now, yet its echo rolled on. Into Parliament's chambers, across Scotland's council tables, and into the private councils of the king. Marston Moor had stripped the Royalists of the north, but the war was far from won. The king's armies still held strong in the west and south, and the conflict had entered a phase where attrition, endurance, and organization would determine the final victor. Parliament knew that to finish the struggle, it needed more than scattered victories. It needed an army unlike any England had ever seen. The triumph at Marston Moor had revealed two things: that discipline and unity could overcome numbers and bravado, and that the war could no longer be fought by a patchwork of regional forces tied to local loyalties. The Eastern Association Army, the Scottish Covenanting Host, and the various parliamentarian garrisons had each fought bravely, but their coordination was fragile, their supply inconsistent, and their command too often divided by politics. A new model was needed, one that would sweep away the old feudal habits of service and replace them with a national fighting force. It was in this climate that the idea of a new model army began to take form. Its principles were as radical as they were necessary. First, it would be a standing army, centrally funded and maintained, not reliant on temporary levies or the goodwill of local militias. Second, its officers would be chosen for merit, not birth, an idea that cut to the heart of England's class-bound tradition. And third, it would be trained, equipped, and drilled to a single standard, ensuring that its regiments could operate as one cohesive war machine across any theater of the conflict. The vision drew inspiration from the best elements of existing forces. From the Scots came the deep discipline of their pike and shot formations. From Cromwell's cavalry, the relentless pursuit that had shattered the royalist flank at Marston Moor. From the parliamentarian infantry, the tenacity to hold ground under the heaviest pressure. It was, in essence, an attempt to distill victory into an institution. But reform did not come without resistance. Many in Parliament feared that a permanent army, loyal to its own commanders rather than the legislature, could become a danger to liberty itself. There were bitter debates in Westminster over cost, command, and the risk of empowering men like Cromwell, whose fame was rising with each campaign. Yet the war's demands left little room for hesitation. The Royalists were regrouping. Their cavalry still roamed the countryside, and winter garrisons had to be supplied and defended. The push for reform was formalized in the Self-Denying Ordinance, a measure that required members of Parliament to resign their military commands, stripping away the old entanglement of political and military authority. In its place, professional soldiers would take the field, led not by nobles with divided loyalties, but by commanders tested in battle. In early 1645, the transformation began in earnest. Regiments were reorganized, pay and supply regularized, and a unified command structure established under Sir Thomas Fairfax as Lord General. Cromwell, though technically affected by the Self-Denying Ordinance, was retained by special order, his value as cavalry commander too great to lose. The men who now filled the ranks were not bound by shire or estate. They were bound by oath, discipline, and the promise of victory. Thus, in the crucible of war, England forged a new weapon, one that would not merely fight battles, but win them decisively. The new model army would march not for county, but for cause, not for plunder, but for the remaking of the realm. Its creation marked the moment when Parliament ceased to be a coalition of local forces and became a national power capable of bringing the king to his knees. The Battle of Naseby, 1645. The new model army had been born in Parliament's councils, drilled on muddy fields, and tempered by long months of preparation. But an army is only as real as its performance under fire. In the summer of 1645, its moment came. The king, seeking to regain momentum, had struck west toward Leicester, hoping to draw Parliament's forces away from Oxford and force them into a battle on ground of his choosing. His army, under the direct command of Charles I and the indomitable Prince Rupert, still possessed the Royalist cavalry's legendary speed and shock. If he could destroy Fairfax's new host before it proved itself, the tide of war might yet be reversed. Parliament's leaders, however, had no intention of avoiding a fight. The new model army had been created for precisely this purpose, to meet the king's field army in open battle and break it beyond repair. When news came that the Royalists were marching south from Leicester, Sir Thomas Fairfax steered his force to intercept, with Oliver Cromwell rejoining the cavalry after Parliament suspended the Self-Denying Ordinance in his favor. It would be the first time the new model would fight as a single unified weapon. The armies met near the small Northamptonshire village of Naseby on June 14, 1645. The field was open, gently rising on both flanks, with a shallow valley between. Fairfax deployed his infantry in the center, flanked by Cromwell's horse on the right and Henry Ireton's on the left. The artillery was positioned to cover the forward slope, ready to disrupt any Royalist advance. Charles's plan was bold but familiar. Rupert's cavalry would smash the enemy's left, while the infantry in the center drove forward, and Goring's horse on the royalist left held Cromwell in check. At dawn, with the sun breaking through scattered clouds, Rupert's trumpet sounded the charge. His cavalry, still the finest in England, surged forward like a wave of steel, crashing into Ireton's wing. The parliamentarian left buckled under the impact, and Rupert's men, as so often before, pursued their advantage with irresistible energy, too far and too fast. While Rupert chased the fleeing parliamentarian horse off the field, the center of the battle was decided elsewhere. In the valley, the new model's infantry, disciplined, drilled, and stubborn, met the royalist foot with a steadiness unseen in earlier parliamentarian armies. Pike blocks held their ground, musketeers poured volleys into advancing ranks, and slowly the royalist line began to bend. On the parliamentarian right, Cromwell unleashed his Ironsides. With the precision of a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil, they hit the royalist cavalry opposite them and shattered it. This time, there was no wild pursuit. Cromwell wheeled his squadrons inward, striking the royalist infantry in the flank just as Fairfax's center pressed forward. Trapped between two blows, the king's foot soldiers broke. Rupert, returning too late from his distant chase, found the battle already lost. The royalist army collapsed into retreat, leaving behind its baggage train, artillery, and, most disastrously, the king's personal correspondence. Those captured letters, later published by Parliament, revealed Charles's continued dealings with Irish Catholics and foreign powers, shattering what remained of his credibility. Naseby was more than a battlefield victory. It was the destruction of the king's main field army. In a single day, the new model had proven its worth beyond doubt, smashing the royalist cause in the open field and ensuring that from now on, Parliament held the strategic initiative. As the wind swept across the quiet fields that evening, the new model's red-coated ranks stood unbroken, their discipline intact, their commanders already looking to the campaigns ahead. Naseby was not the end of the war, but it was the day the royalist cause was mortally wounded. From the moment the first muskets fired in the morning mist to the final rout in the afternoon sun, England had seen the future of war, and it wore the face of the new model army. The Battle of Langport, 1645. The victory at Naseby had shattered the king's main army and stripped away his ability to face Parliament in the open field. Yet the war was not over. In the rugged west of England, the Royalists still held a bastion of strength, Somerset, Devon, and Cornwall, under the command of Lord Goring. These western counties, with their natural defenses of hills, rivers, and narrow roads, had long been a thorn in Parliament's side. From here, Royalist cavalry had raided deep into parliamentarian territory, burning villages, cutting supply lines, and forcing Fairfax to divert troops away from the main theaters of war. Now, with the new model army proven in battle and Parliament holding the initiative, Fairfax and Cromwell turned their attention westward. The campaign would be no mere raid. It was a march to crush the last organized royalist resistance outside the king's immediate strongholds. By mid-July 1645, the new model advanced through Somerset, forcing Goring's army back toward the small market town of Langport. The royalist commander, though capable, was hampered by his men's poor discipline and low morale. After months of campaigning without decisive success, his cavalry was worn and his infantry reluctant. Still, he chose to make a stand on the ridge east of Langport, using the steep slopes, hedgerows, and the narrow valley below as natural barriers. Fairfax recognized that speed was essential. If Goring escaped west to link up with the garrisons at Bridgewater and Exeter, the campaign could drag on for months. So, on July 10th, the new model struck. The battle began with parliamentarian artillery pounding the royalist ridge, their shot echoing across the valley. Then Cromwell's cavalry moved forward, not in a wild gallop but in disciplined squadrons, clearing royalist outposts along the approach. The fight in the valley was fierce, Hedges and ditches turned every advance into a series of brutal close-quarters clashes. Musketeers fired from behind earthworks, cavalry struggled to maneuver in the confined lanes, and the air filled with powder smoke. But once again, Parliament's discipline told. Cromwell's Ironsides broke through the Royalist horse guarding the flanks, turning their lines inward. In the center, Fairfax pushed infantry up the slope, their pikes lowered, their volleys steady. The Royalist defense wavered, then collapsed entirely as Parliament's cavalry swept over the ridge and into the open ground beyond. What followed was a rout. Goring's army, already brittle, disintegrated under the pressure. Many threw down their arms and fled. Others were cut off and captured. Langport itself fell quickly, and with it the gateway to the west. Within days, Fairfax was pressing on to besiege Bridgewater, the next major Royalist stronghold. Langport was not as large a battle as Naseby, but its consequences were enormous. It marked the end of any serious Royalist field force in the west of England. From this point forward, the war in the west would be a series of sieges and mopping-up operations, not pitched battles. The king's cause, already reeling from Naseby, was now bleeding from a second deep wound. In Parliament's camp, there was a growing sense that the end was in sight. The new model army had proven not only its ability to win in the open field, but also its capacity to break an enemy entrenched in difficult country. And for the Royalists, Langport was a grim reminder that the days of glorious cavalry charges and sudden reversals were gone. The parliamentarian war machine was now too strong, too unified, and too relentless to be stopped. The collapse of the Royalist cause. Langport had been more than a battlefield defeat. It was the unraveling of the king's last real army in the west. With Somerset breached and Lord Goring's force scattered, the road lay open for Parliament to grind down the remaining Royalist strongholds one by one. And grind they did. The weeks that followed saw the new model army move like a storm front across the West Country. Bridgewater fell in late July, its defenders worn down by bombardment and the knowledge that no relief would come. From there, Fairfax pressed on to Bristol, the great port city whose walls had withstood earlier parliamentarian attempts. Now, however, it faced the full weight of the new model's siege artillery and disciplined assault troops. Even the resolve of Prince Rupert, appointed governor of the city, could not save it. In September 1645, Bristol surrendered, and Rupert, once the fiery symbol of Royalist dash, was dismissed by the king, his star dimmed beyond recovery. While Parliament's forces swept the west, Cromwell and Fairfax coordinated campaigns to choke off Royalist positions elsewhere. In the Midlands and the North, smaller parliamentarian armies mopped up pockets of resistance, cutting supply routes and forcing garrisons to capitulate. The Royalist war effort was no longer a coordinated campaign. It was a scattering of desperate holds, each hoping for a miracle that would never come. The collapse was not only military, it was political and psychological. The correspondence captured at Naseby had already revealed Charles's secret dealings with Irish Catholics and foreign powers, alienating moderates who might have sought peace. The once confident Royalist Parliament at Oxford now sat in gloom, its members watching towns and castles fall in steady succession. The king's messages to his commanders carried not the language of strategy, but of pleading. By the winter of 1645-46, the Royalists were fighting a war of survival. In the north, Newcastle, the jewel of Royalist power, surrendered to the Scots. In the southwest, Exeter and Plymouth stood isolated, surrounded by parliamentarian lines. Even Oxford, the king's wartime capital, was within striking distance of the new model army. Charles sought to rally his cause with diplomacy, but every avenue closed before him. Parliament, emboldened by victory, demanded terms that stripped the monarchy of its power to wage war. The Scots, holding the king's northern hopes in their hands, pressed for religious concessions that Charles would not grant. Abroad, potential allies saw a cause already lost. The final blow came in the spring of 1646. when the king abandoned Oxford and placed himself in the custody of the Scottish army at Southwell. It was a desperate gamble, hoping the Scots would prove more favorable negotiators than Parliament. Instead, it marked the symbolic end of his reign as a military leader. The once proud royalist cause, launched in 1642 with banners flying and horsemen charging, had dwindled into a procession of surrenders. For Parliament, the collapse was the vindication of every hard decision. The creation of the new model army, the reforms that had alienated old allies, the unflinching pursuit of victory. For the king's followers, it was the bitter recognition that courage alone cannot overcome discipline, unity, and resources. Thus ended the First English Civil War. The fields that had echoed with musket volleys and cavalry charges lay silent, but the questions of governance, religion, and the very nature of kingship were far from settled. The royalist cause had fallen, but the struggle for England's soul had only entered a new, more dangerous phase. Causes of renewed conflict. The banners had been furled, the cannon silenced, and the king's armies scattered. In the spring of 1646, Parliament stood triumphant, master of England's cities, fortresses, and fields. Yet victory did not bring peace. Only a pause, uneasy and brittle. For beneath the quiet, the embers of civil strife still glowed, waiting for the wind to rise again. The first seeds of renewed conflict were sown in the very manner of the king's surrender. Charles had yielded himself not to Parliament, but to the Scottish army at Southwell. It was a calculated act of self-preservation, for the king believed the Scots might protect him from the harsher demands of Westminster. But this choice drove a wedge between the victors. Parliament and the Scots had been uneasy allies from the start, bound together by the Solemn League and Covenant, yet divided by deeper mistrust. The Scots sought to see their Presbyterian system established in England. Many in Parliament, especially the Independents, resisted any national imposition of religion. In the king's person, these rivalries now had a bargaining chip and a powder keg. Meanwhile, the new model army, which had borne the weight of the final campaigns, found itself in a dangerous position. Parliament, wary of maintaining a large standing force in peacetime, moved to disband regiments and withhold pay. To the soldiers, many of whom had not received full wages in months, this was a betrayal. Worse still, the proposed settlement with the king appeared to offer too much leniency, threatening to undo the sacrifices made on the battlefield. Within the ranks, a new political consciousness began to stir, as soldiers debated not only military grievances, but questions of liberty, governance, and the very meaning of the war they had fought. The king, for his part, was far from reconciled to defeat. Though outwardly a prisoner, he played the factions against one another with quiet skill. To Parliament's Presbyterians, he hinted at cooperation against the Independents. To the Scots, he suggested concessions on church governance. To foreign powers, he whispered promises of alliance in exchange for military aid. Charles was betting on what had once saved him before, that his enemies, divided among themselves, would fail to hold him in check. By 1647, the fragile unity of the victors had collapsed into open quarrel. The Scots, frustrated by Parliament's refusal to impose Presbyterianism, withdrew from England, taking the king's fate into new uncertainty. The new model army, refusing disbandment without redress, marched on London in a show of force. In its councils of officers and elected agitators, radical ideas of popular sovereignty and expanded rights found voice. For some in Parliament, this was as dangerous as the king himself. It was in this tense atmosphere that Charles made his most fateful move. In November 1647, he escaped from Hampton Court and opened secret negotiations with the Scots. The resulting engagement promised that Charles would establish Presbyterianism in England for 3 years, in return for Scottish military support to restore him to the throne. With that pact, the peace was doomed. In early 1648, royalist risings broke out across England and Wales, fueled by lingering loyalty to the crown, resentment against Parliament's rule, and anger at the army's growing power. The Scots prepared to invade from the north. The Second Civil War had begun, not as the clear clash of king against Parliament seen in 1642, but as a tangled conflict born from mistrust, political ambition, and the refusal of any side to surrender its vision for England's future. Thus, the wheel of war turned once more, not because the first had ended in indecision, but because peace itself had proven too fragile to survive the ambitions of men. The struggle for England's soul was not over. It was about to enter its darkest, most decisive chapter. The campaign of 1648. The engagement between King Charles and the Scots had lit the fuse. Across England and Wales, discontent that had smoldered since the end of the First Civil War now burst into flame. Royalist risings erupted in Kent, Essex, South Wales, and the North. For the first time since 1646, the sound of the war drum echoed from coast to coast. But this war was not the same as the first. The divisions of the victors, the restlessness of the vanquished, and the shifting loyalties of the Scots made the conflict more tangled and more dangerous. In the spring of 1648, the first sparks flew in South Wales, where disbanded parliamentarian soldiers, unpaid and resentful, turned their arms against the very cause they had served. They declared for the king, seizing towns and fortifications. In Kent, royalist sentiment swelled into open rebellion, culminating in the occupation of Maidstone. In Essex, Colchester became a royalist stronghold, bristling with defiance. Simultaneously, in the north, royalist leaders rallied forces in anticipation of the long-promised Scottish invasion. Parliament, though still riven by political disputes, reacted with decisive speed. The new model army, seasoned, disciplined, and unburdened by the uncertainties of 1642, moved like a single iron hand to crush the uprisings one by one. In June, Fairfax stormed Maidstone in a night of brutal street fighting, driving the Royalists into retreat. In Wales, Colonel Thomas Horton defeated the rebels at the Battle of St. Fagans, opening the road for Cromwell to march in and secure the region. By the time the summer heat set in, Wales was once again firmly under Parliament's control. The rebellion in Essex proved more stubborn. Fairfax marched north to besiege Colchester in June, encircling the town and cutting it off from relief. The siege dragged into the heart of summer, marked by fierce sallies from the garrison and equally determined counterattacks. Inside, the Royalists suffered hunger and disease. Outside, Parliament's lines grew ever tighter. When the town finally surrendered in late August, the parliamentarian command made a grim example, executing the senior Royalist officers for breaking their paroles from the First Civil War. But the most dangerous threat came from the north. In July 1648, the Scottish Engager Army, honoring their pact with Charles, crossed the border under the command of the Duke of Hamilton. Numbering around 20,000, they advanced south with the aim of linking up with English Royalists and marching on London. Yet they were slow-moving, poorly supplied, and plagued by divided leadership. Cromwell, freed from his Welsh campaign, raced north to intercept. The decisive clash came in mid-August at the Battle of Preston. Over 3 days of relentless fighting, Cromwell's smaller but far more disciplined force harried, outmaneuvered, and broke the Scots in detail. Rain turned the fields into mud, hampering the Engagers' retreat and allowing Parliament's cavalry to cut them down piecemeal. When the battle ended, Hamilton's army was shattered, thousands captured, and the Scottish threat extinguished. By the close of 1648, the Second Civil War was effectively over. Every major Royalist rising had been crushed, the Scots had been humbled, and the king, still a prisoner, now stood as the central obstacle to lasting peace. But the mood in Parliament and the army had changed. Many officers, hardened by the renewed bloodshed, now believed that as long as Charles lived, England would never know stability. The war had begun as a contest for political settlement. By the year's end, it had become a question of justice, or vengeance. And in that grim transformation lay the path to the scaffold at Whitehall. The King's Trial and Execution, 1649. The Second Civil War had ended not with compromise, but with the crushing certainty of military victory. To the new model army, the year's bloodshed had confirmed what many of its leaders had long suspected. King Charles III was not merely a beaten opponent, but the root cause of England's unrest. If spared, he would conspire again. If restored, he would wage war anew. In their eyes, the sword had failed to secure peace. Only a sterner remedy remained. Parliament, however, was not united on this grim course. Many members still clung to the hope of reconciliation, believing that the monarchy could be preserved under strict constitutional limits. To the army's radicals and independents, this was dangerous folly. They had fought 2 wars, lost friends and brothers, endured privation and blood, only to see the same man, unrepentant, untrustworthy, return to the throne. Such an outcome, they believed, would make every sacrifice meaningless. In December 1648, the army acted. Under the command of Colonel Thomas Pride, soldiers surrounded the House of Commons in what became known as Pride's Purge. Members sympathetic to the king were barred or arrested, leaving behind a rump parliament willing to proceed with a trial. It was an act without precedent, an army imposing its will on the nation's elected body, but the officers justified it as a necessity to secure the revolution's gains. The trial opened in January 1649 in Westminster Hall, transformed into a vast court of state. John Bradshaw, in his black robes and broad hat, presided over the proceedings. The charge was stark and unprecedented. That Charles Stuart, entrusted as king, had been a tyrant, a traitor to his people, and guilty of waging war against his own subjects. The hall was packed with soldiers, officials, and silent onlookers, the air heavy with the knowledge that this was no ordinary cause. Charles, dignified yet defiant, refused to recognize the court's legitimacy. He would not plead nor acknowledge the right of mere subjects to judge their king. His stance was as much political theater as legal argument, a final assertion of divine right in the face of mortal judgment. But his silence could not halt the machinery now in motion. After days of witness testimony, declarations, and the reading of charges, the court delivered its verdict. Charles was guilty. The sentence, death by beheading. On the morning of 30th of January 1649, the king walked from St. James's Palace to Whitehall, dressed in 2 shirts to ward off the cold and prevent his shivering from being mistaken for fear. The scaffold, draped in black, stood before the banqueting house. A small crowd gathered, muted, anxious, many unable to believe what they were about to witness. Charles addressed them briefly, speaking of liberty, law, and his conscience before God. He laid his head upon the block, signaled his readiness, and with one stroke of the executioner's axe, the reign of Charles I ended. A low groan rose from the crowd, a sound of awe and dread. For the first time in English history, a reigning monarch had been tried and executed by his own people. The act sent shockwaves across Europe. Some saw it as the dawn of a new liberty, others as the most heinous regicide in Christendom. But for the men who had ordered it, this was not simply punishment. It was the closing of an age. The monarchy was abolished, the House of Lords dissolved, and England was declared a Commonwealth, to be governed as a republic. Yet even in this moment of triumph for Parliament and the army, the future was uncertain. The head of the king had fallen, but the question remained, could the kingdom endure without a crown? Political impact. The axe had fallen, and with it, the ancient order of England. On 30 January 1649, the execution of Charles I severed more than a king's life. It cut through centuries of monarchy's unbroken authority. The tremor was immediate and far-reaching. Across Europe, monarchs recoiled in horror. Across England, people whispered in disbelief. The question was no longer whether the king could be restrained, it was whether a kingdom could endure without one. Within days, Parliament moved to solidify the revolution's gains. The House of Lords, long the preserve of hereditary nobility, was abolished as useless and dangerous. The monarchy itself was declared unlawful, and England was proclaimed a Commonwealth, a free state governed by the representatives of the people. In theory, it was the triumph of popular sovereignty. In practice, it was the rule of the Rump Parliament, backed by the might of the new model army. The political shockwaves extended beyond the formal structures of government. The regicide emboldened radical voices that had, until now, been kept in check. Groups like the Levelers pressed for sweeping democratic reforms, expanded suffrage, equality before the law, and religious freedom. Pamphlets flooded the streets of London, envisioning a society unbound from feudal privilege. Yet for all their ideals, these movements often clashed with the more conservative instincts of Parliament's leaders, who feared that too much liberty, too soon, would plunge the nation into chaos. Outside the capital, the reaction was mixed and volatile. In the royalist strongholds of the countryside, the execution deepened resentment and martyrized the late king in the eyes of his supporters. In Scotland, where Charles II was declared king under the Covenant, the act was seen not as justice, but as murder, ensuring that the war's embers would continue to smolder. In Ireland, the political void invited a brutal reconquest, soon to be led by Cromwell himself. Internationally, the regicide isolated England diplomatically. Catholic powers condemned it outright. Protestant states treated the new republic with caution, unsure whether it could survive. The Dutch, long England's commercial rivals, eyed the upheaval as both a danger and an opportunity. France, under the regency of Anne of Austria, watched warily, concerned that republican ideas might spread across the Channel. Yet within the corridors of Westminster, there was also a sense of liberation, a belief that England had stepped onto the stage of history as a pioneer of self-government. The leaders of the Rump saw themselves as guardians of a fragile but unprecedented experiment. They spoke of securing a firm peace at home and a name of honor abroad. Still, they were under no illusions about the dangers ahead. The Commonwealth was surrounded by hostile monarchies, riven by internal faction, and dependent on the loyalty of an army that was as much a political force as a military one. In the months that followed, the political landscape was reshaped with ruthless efficiency. Laws were rewritten, royal symbols torn down, and the machinery of the old court dismantled. The very language of governance shifted. No longer His Majesty's realm, but the People's Commonwealth. It was a revolution not only of institutions, but of imagination, demanding that Englishmen see themselves not as subjects of a sovereign, but as citizens of a republic. Still, the shadow of the executed king lingered. To royalists, he was a sainted martyr. To republicans, a necessary sacrifice. To moderates, a tragic warning. The political impact of his death was thus both unifying and divisive, uniting the revolutionary core while alienating vast swaths of the population. In this contradiction lay the challenge that would define the years to come, whether the Commonwealth could govern a kingdom whose heart was still, in many places, loyal to its crown. The Irish Campaign. The birth of the Commonwealth had been an act of political daring. Its survival would be an act of war. Even as England adjusted to life without a king, threats pressed in from every horizon. In the West, Ireland was aflame. There, the political vacuum of the king's fall had deepened an already volatile conflict, one that mixed rebellion, religion, and revenge into a single combustible struggle. Since 1641, Ireland had been in turmoil. The Catholic uprising that year had led to the massacre of Protestant settlers in Ulster and ignited a war between Irish Confederates, English Royalists, and Parliament's forces. By 1649, the picture was more complicated still. The Irish Catholic Confederation, the Royalist remnants, and some Protestant forces had forged an unlikely alliance under the banner of Charles II, the exiled son of the executed king. Their aim was nothing less than the expulsion of Parliament's authority from Ireland, and perhaps the launching of a counterstroke into England itself. For the Rump Parliament, this was intolerable. Ireland was not only a rebellious province, it was a potential springboard for foreign intervention. If left unchecked, it could become the staging ground for a royalist restoration. The response would be decisive and uncompromising. Parliament turned to its most formidable commander, Oliver Cromwell, to crush the Irish alliance and secure the realm's western flank. In August 1649, Cromwell sailed from Bristol with some 12,000 veterans of the New Model Army. Hardened by years of civil war, they were disciplined, well-equipped, and driven by a cause they believed was both political and divine. For Cromwell, the campaign was more than a military necessity. It was, in his mind, a mission of providence to bring order, Protestant faith, and obedience to a land he saw as steeped in rebellion. The first target was Drogheda, a fortified port city on the River Boyne. The siege began in early September. Cromwell's artillery pounded the walls without pause, and on 11 September, the breach was stormed. What followed would echo through history. The garrison was slaughtered almost to a man, and many civilians were killed in the chaos. To Cromwell, this was divine judgment, a terror that would, he hoped, prevent further bloodshed by compelling other towns to surrender without resistance. To his enemies, it was butchery. "I am persuaded," Cromwell wrote to Parliament, "that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches." The next month brought Wexford to the same fate. Negotiations for surrender collapsed into confusion, and parliamentarian troops stormed the town, killing hundreds, including many civilians, and seizing the harbor. The brutal reputation of Cromwell's army spread quickly, and several Irish towns capitulated rather than face similar destruction. Yet the campaign was not only a tale of swift sieges and hard steel, it was also a war of attrition against disease, supply shortages, and the sheer resilience of the Irish countryside. The Royalist-Confederate alliance fractured under pressure, its leaders unable to mount a unified resistance. Cromwell advanced methodically, securing ports, fortresses, and supply lines before moving deeper inland. By the spring of 1650, the Irish War was far from over, but its momentum had shifted decisively in Parliament's favor. Cromwell, recalled to England to face the looming Scottish threat, left the mopping-up operations to trusted lieutenants such as Henry Ireton and Charles Fleetwood. The campaign would drag on for another 2 years, marked by sieges, skirmishes, and famine, but the backbone of organized resistance had been broken. The Irish campaign remains one of the most contested episodes in Cromwell's career. To his supporters, it was a necessary and decisive blow that secured the Commonwealth's survival. To his critics, it was an indelible stain, a ruthless war marked by massacres that scarred Anglo-Irish relations for generations. In either view, it was a turning point. With Ireland subdued, the Commonwealth could turn its gaze northward, where a new and formidable challenge was already taking shape. For across the border, the Scots had crowned Charles II King of Scotland. Another war was coming, one that would pit the Republic against a restored Stuart monarchy and test the mettle of the New Model Army in the rugged hills and open fields of the north. The Scottish campaign. The cannons of Drogheda had barely fallen silent when another summons reached Cromwell's hand. To the north, the hills of Scotland stirred with the banners of war. There, the execution of Charles I had been met not with acquiescence, but with open defiance. The Scots, bound by the Solemn League and Covenant, had crowned his exiled son Charles II as King of Scotland. In their eyes, monarchy was not the enemy. It was the vessel of their covenant faith. For the Commonwealth, this was an existential challenge. If Charles II could rally Scottish forces and march south, he might spark a royalist uprising in England itself. Worse, He could invite foreign aid from France or the Dutch Republic, turning Britain's internal strife into a continental war. The lesson of Ireland was clear. No hostile crown could be allowed to survive on English borders. In July 1650, Cromwell, now Captain General of the New Model Army, marched north at the head of some 16,000 veterans. These were men hardened by a decade of campaigning, carrying with them the iron discipline that had broken the king's armies, the Irish strongholds, and the will of their foes. Against them stood the Scottish Covenanter army, commanded by David Leslie, a capable soldier who knew both Cromwell's strengths and the unforgiving terrain of his homeland. The opening weeks were a trial of endurance rather than steel. Summer rains turned the roads to rivers of mud. The Scottish commanders, wary of Cromwell's battlefield skill, refused open battle and instead adopted a Fabian strategy, entrenching behind strong defensive lines near Leith and Edinburgh, cutting off supplies to force the English to wither in the field. Sickness stalked the parliamentarian camp. Provisions dwindled, horses died in the mire. By late August, Cromwell's situation was perilous. Retreat seemed the only choice. Yet fate would soon deliver the chance he sought. On the eastern coast at Dunbar, the Scots moved to block his withdrawal south, believing the English trapped between the sea and the hills. Leslie held the high ground with a force nearly twice Cromwell's size. To many, it looked like the end of the campaign. Cromwell, however, read the field differently. On the night of 2nd September 1650, under the cover of darkness and heavy rain, he prepared a preemptive strike. "The Lord hath delivered them into our hands," he told his officers. At dawn on 3rd September, the New Model Army surged forward. The attack smashed into the Scottish right flank, driving it into disorder. Momentum built like a wave. Disciplined musket fire and relentless cavalry charges turned the Scots' proud line into a rout. By mid-morning, the battle was over. Thousands of Scots lay dead or captured. Cromwell's losses were minimal. Dunbar was not merely a victory, it was a deliverance. The triumph opened the gates of Edinburgh, which soon surrendered and shattered the immediate Scottish threat. Yet Charles II remained at large, moving west to rally his supporters. For nearly a year, the war continued in a campaign of pursuit and maneuver, culminating in the royalist gamble of an invasion of England in 1651. In August of that year, Charles's army swept south, hoping to ignite a popular rising. But the land they marched through was wary and silent. The English people, weary of years of war, offered little support. Cromwell shadowed them, waiting for the moment to strike. That moment came at Worcester on 3rd September 1651, exactly 1 year after Dunbar. There, in a fierce, sprawling battle across fields, bridges, and city streets, the New Model Army enveloped the Royalist force. Charles II barely escaped with his life, beginning a desperate 6-week flight through England that would pass into legend. His cause, however, was broken. The Scottish army lay in ruins. The threat of a Stuart restoration by force of arms was, for the moment, ended. The Scottish campaign was a masterclass in endurance, maneuver, and decisive assault. It displayed Cromwell's capacity to read not only the ground and the enemy, but the moment when boldness could transform peril into triumph. With Scotland subdued and Charles II a fugitive in foreign lands, the Commonwealth stood unchallenged on Britain's soil for the first time. Yet even as the union of the sword was secured, storms brewed overseas. The Dutch, those masters of the sea, were watching, and soon England's destiny would shift from land to water, from the clash of pikes to the roar of broadside cannon. Long-term consequences. The smoke of Worcester had scarcely cleared when the reality of the Commonwealth's new position came into focus. For the first time in living memory, the sword of a single government ruled from the southern shores of England to the highlands of Scotland, from the cliffs of Wales to the windswept coasts of Ireland. The Stuart threat had been scattered. Charles II was a king without a kingdom, exiled to foreign courts and dependent on the charity of monarchs who feared his cause as much as they pitied it. Yet the price of this supremacy was high. The wars of the 1640s and early 1650s had drained England's coffers, cost tens of thousands of lives, and scarred the land with a decade of unrest. Fields lay fallow, villages half-deserted, trade routes disrupted. Even in victory, the Commonwealth inherited a realm weary to its bones. Politically, the triumph over Ireland and Scotland transformed the Commonwealth into more than an English republic. It was, in practice, the first centralized British state. The sword had achieved what no monarch had done by consent, the union of the three kingdoms under a single regime. But it was a union born of conquest, not compromise, and beneath its surface the embers of resistance still glowed. In the Scottish Kirk and the Irish countryside, Parliament's authority was obeyed more from necessity than devotion. Within Westminster, the victory strengthened the hand of the Rump Parliament, but also deepened tensions with the new model army. The soldiers, who had carried the revolution on their shoulders, expected the fruits of their labor: religious liberty for godly congregations, reform of the law, and an end to corruption. Parliament, cautious and often self-serving, moved more slowly, guarding its privileges. The uneasy alliance between sword and statute would soon become a central fault line in the Republic's future. Internationally, the outcome of the British campaigns altered the balance of power. European courts recognized that the Commonwealth was no fleeting experiment. It had the strength to defend itself against internal and external threats. Some, like France, treated it with wary diplomacy. Others, like the Dutch Republic, saw in England's consolidation both a formidable rival and a potential partner. But rivalry would soon outweigh partnership, for commerce was the bloodstream of both nations, and competition for the world's trade routes could not be contained forever. Culturally, the victories fed a sense of providential destiny among the Commonwealth's supporters. Sermons in London's pulpits and pamphlets on its streets proclaimed that God had vindicated his cause through the arms of the godly. Cromwell himself, though cautious of self-glorification, could not deny the sense that history had turned in their favor. "The Lord hath done this," he had declared after Dunbar. Worcester only deepened that conviction. But not all hearts shared the same exultation. For royalists in exile, the defeats in Scotland and Worcester were not the end, but the beginning of a long, bitter wait for restoration. They nursed their cause in the courts of Paris and The Hague, cultivated foreign sympathy, and plotted for a day when England's republican experiment might falter. In the towns and shires, ordinary people weighed the meaning of the new order. Many cared less for the political philosophy of the Commonwealth than for the return of stability, fair taxation, and the reopening of markets. For them, the long-term consequence of victory was measured in bread on the table and the safety of their homes. Strategically, the campaigns of 1649 to 1651 gave the Commonwealth an unchallenged land frontier, freeing it to turn its energies outward. With the British Isles under firm control, England could now project its power overseas, to defend its colonies, expand its trade, and challenge its maritime rivals. The stage was set for a new kind of war, one fought not in muddy fields, but on the rolling decks of ships, where the fate of empires was measured in broadsides. Thus, the long-term consequence of the Commonwealth's victories was twofold: the consolidation of Britain under a republican regime and the pivot from internal survival to external ambition. The next great struggle would not be with kings on horseback, but with admirals at sea. And as Parliament looked across the Channel, its gaze fixed on the merchant fleets of the Dutch, it was clear that the Commonwealth's destiny, like that of its foes, was no longer bound solely to the land. The wars of the islands were over. The wars of the oceans were about to begin. Yet as Parliament's gaze shifted from the conquered highlands and pacified shires toward the restless seas beyond the Channel, the meaning of these hard-won victories began to take shape in the minds of contemporaries. For the campaigns of the 1640s and early 1650s had not only redrawn the map of the British Isles, they had reshaped the very idea of what Britain was and could be. The battles fought from Edge Hill to Worcester were more than episodes of civil strife. They were the trials by fire through which a new political order was forged. The wars that forged a nation. From the first clash of arms in 1642 to the smoke-dimmed skies above Worcester in 1651, the wars that tore across England, Scotland, and Ireland were more than a struggle for power. They were a crucible in which the fate of the British Isles was recast. What began as a contest between a king and his parliament became a revolution that toppled monarchy, shattered ancient privileges, and dared to imagine a realm ruled by the will of its people, or at least by those who claimed to speak for them. Through the shifting tides of battle, Edgehill, Marston Moor, Naseby, the new model army emerged as both sword and shield of the Revolution, its discipline and conviction carrying the cause to triumph. Ireland felt the iron hand of conquest. Scotland, the sting of defeat at Dunbar and Worcester. By the war's end, for the first time in history, a single government ruled all three kingdoms, not by inheritance, but by the force of arms and the resolve of men convinced they served both God and history. Yet the Commonwealth's victories came at a cost written in blood and ruin. Cities battered by siege, fields untended, trade disrupted, and a generation marked by loss. These were the shadows cast by the sun of triumph. And though the Stuart crown had been shattered, its fragments lay scattered across the courts of Europe, waiting for the chance to be pieced together again. Politically, the war had reshaped the realm. The monarchy was gone. The divine right of kings lay in the dust. In its place stood a republic, fragile, untested, and divided within itself. Parliament held the reins, but the army that had carried it to power was no ordinary tool. It was a force with its own vision of the nation's future. In that uneasy partnership, the seeds of future conflict were already sown. Internationally, the Commonwealth emerged from the civil wars not as an isolated experiment, but as a power to be reckoned with. Its armies had conquered Britain's frontiers, its fleets now prepared to contest the seas. The attention that once fixed on the battlefields of York and Worcester would soon turn to the waters of the Channel and beyond, where Dutch merchantmen and English warships would test each other's strength. In the end, the English civil wars were not merely the story of battles won and kings overthrown. They were the forging of a new political reality, one that questioned the old certainties of rule, redefined the relationship between government and governed, and placed England, for a brief and restless moment, at the vanguard of republican ambition in Europe. But if the sword had carved out a new order, it could not alone secure it. That would be the work of statesmen, merchants, sailors, and ordinary citizens, living in the long shadow of war, shaping the peace that followed. The world beyond Britain's shores was waiting, and the age of civil strife was giving way to the age of empire.